Have you ever noticed that we've got a tendency, and I know it's not just me. I think it's part of human nature. It's just one of the things that we get really good at as we get older. But we learn it early in childhood that we do a really good job of minimizing our shortcomings and maximizing our strengths. It's just one of the things we get really good at. And you've probably noticed that we're also really good at covering up our mistakes. Really good at that. My kids have become really, really good at that. But if you want to see something really impressive, you should watch people that are trying to defend somebody who has made a mistake that's on their team. Have you ever seen that? The way that teams just kind of come together and defend each other, even when it's really obvious to everybody that there has been some wrongdoing. And it can be impressive in a weird way, how we defend those that are indefensible, especially if that person is the leader of your team. Have you seen that? Especially when those shortcomings or failures or sins become public. And if you want to watch something that will just boggle your mind, at least it does me, it's the campaign of misinformation, the cover-up, the denial that happens when that sin that started out as private is threatened to become public. And that's exactly what he did. He tried to cover it up. He tried to deny it. He committed more sins trying to cover up the original sin. And it just kind of started to spiral from there. It worked for a while, a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two. But then the secret got out, didn't it? I mean, it always does, but it got out. The whistle was blown, and we all know the story. We all know that it happened. Nobody's really disputing the facts. You can't really dispute the facts. And you can read what happened. I mean, it's not an actual word-for-word transcript, but it's there, and you can read it for yourself. And so when Matthew points out this secret sin that King David had committed and then tried to cover up, it jolted the people of Israel that were reading this for the very first time. It reminded them of this secret sin that had happened and then had been tried to cover up, and all of the stuff that went along with that. And it got worse and worse. And the problem that I think Matthew was addressing in the very first chapter of Matthew, as he puts together this lineage of Jesus, the genealogy, all of these people in the line that led up to the Messiah. I think that what Matthew was trying to do was to combat this tendency that we have as humans, to take the people that we are most fond of and gloss over their failures and pretend like they never happened. Because David was the favorite king of all of Israel. He had kind of become this superhero in the minds of the people. And so he mentions it in the lineage of Jesus, King David, and the woman. But we've all heard the story. All of us have heard this story over and over and over again. It's one of the two things that you probably know about King David. You probably know these two stories best, David and Goliath and David and Bathsheba. And if you want to read that story, you are welcome to do so. It is in 2 Samuel. I encourage you to do it. But tonight, even though as we walk through this series on the lineage of Jesus, all of the stories that Matthew pushes us towards as he's going through all of these generations of people and points out specific stories to remind us, oh yeah, it's not just perfect people. It's not just the righteous. It's not just the wealthy. It's not just the powerful that this Messiah comes from. It's also the sinners. It's also people like me and like you. We've all heard the story of David and Bathsheba, plenty. And so tonight I want to point us towards another story of David. One of the stories that you probably, I'm guessing, have forgotten. Some of you might not have ever even heard this story before. And so tonight I want to focus on it. And it begins in this moment of desperation. When hope was beginning to fade and fade quick. The walls begin to close in, and the way out of this situation began to get narrower and narrower and narrower, and it looked more and more difficult. So, will you turn with me? And we're going to spend a lot of time in this chapter tonight. So, download a Bible app if you need to. You've got time. We're going to be in it for the next 56 minutes. That was a joke. Probably be funnier if I hadn't actually preached that long once or 3 times. I really try hard not to, though. Sometimes I just get going. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25. Now, the book of Samuel, as you can probably guess, gets its name from the prophet Samuel. He's kind of a big deal at this point. And I want to give you a little background of what's going on. The story we're going to look at has to do with a guy named David. David is unbelievably popular in Hebrew culture. Incredibly popular. He's this stand-up guy. He's a great fighter. He's a great commander. He's just an overall lovable guy to be around. Most people absolutely adore David, except for the king. Israel at this point, they were on their very first king. They had just jumped into a monarchy. We kind of been going through a little bit of this history, and I've tried not to really hammer on this a whole lot, so I'm going to try again tonight not to do this, but we had just gotten out of years and years and years and years and years of judges. And it was kind of this wild, wild west, not quite anarchy, but it was a weird governing situation. And so the people of Israel had called out for a king. God, we want this king. We're fine following you, and that's great, but everybody else has a king, and it just seems like it'd be so cool. We want what everybody else wants. And so God says, fine, you're not going to like it. It's not going to go well, but I will give you what you want. That's never a good sign. And so King Saul is on the throne. And King Saul, through jealousy and some mental and emotional instabilities, I'm guessing, ends up absolutely despising David. And so you have David, who again is this incredibly popular guy in Hebrew culture, and he's being hunted throughout the countryside, throughout the wilderness, into the mountains and the caves, and all over the place. Saul is trying to hunt him down and kill him. And at the beginning of chapter 25 in 1 Samuel, we find David, who was once this little shepherd boy, the boy that killed Goliath. He had been anointed by Samuel to be the future king of Israel. He had once found great favor with Saul. He had played in his courts. He was this beautiful magician, not magician, that would have been really cool though too, musician. They're pretty much the same thing, right? Music can be magical. I'm just going to keep digging that hole. Okay. David has become this folk hero for the people of Israel. In fact, he had married the king's youngest daughter. His best friend was the king's son, Jonathan. And now he is on the run. He is hiding in the wilderness with this band of like 600 guys. And the king who he loved, who he had once called father, now hunts him. And the problem is the only guy who had a shred of hope of protecting David from the king has just died, the prophet Samuel, at the beginning of chapter 25. And so David, they have this big funeral, and before anything can happen, he leaves the funeral and he takes his men and they go and they run to the desert, into the wilderness to hide, to try and find some safety from King Saul. And while they're there, they run into the shepherds of this incredibly wealthy man that lives in the area. His name is Nabal. And Nabal, like you and me and David, Nabal has this reputation. Not only is he this really wealthy guy and has thousands of goats and 1,000 sheep and servants and property and all of this wealth, he's also a punk. He's just a jerk. He's rude. He's just this cranky old guy. He is mean. Nabal is just mean. Now, Nabal and I don't have really anything in common. This guy was really, really rich. I'm not. He's got all kinds of property. I don't. He's got sheep and goats and servants, and my servants don't listen to me. They leave Legos all over the place. We don't have a lot in common, but we do have one thing in common, and that is that we married up in life. Listen, I'm doing my best, okay? Just the author of the book of 1 Samuel describes Nabal's wife, Abigail, as, quote, intelligent and beautiful. And she's going to play a huge role in this story in just a little bit. But here's what's happening. David is camping out in the wilderness around Carmel. And Nabal's shepherds are out there, and they're taking care of their sheep, and they're taking care of the goats, and they're kind of doing their stuff. And they end up spending some time close to where David and his men are hiding out. And it seems like from the text and from what most likely would have happened is that they end up interacting a little bit. They end up chatting. They end up talking. And David learns that they're about to go into the time of year where they shear all the sheep. And that's a really festive time. It's this big celebration, and everybody's in good moods. And so David decides to make a big ask of Nabal. David has been living in the wilderness on the run, and he's got 600 guys to take care of. And so he decides, you know what, we're going to do this thing. I'm going to make the ask. And so he sends 10 of his guys down to Nabal, and he asks them to make a plea. You know what? Give this little speech that I'm going to tell you here in just a second. These guys, what I want you to know is David's men have been out in the wilderness for quite a while. They've been away from their homes for quite a while. They've been living off of the land for quite a long time. And David has been through the ringer. None of this stuff, when he was a little kid in his dad's household, and the prophet Samuel had come to their home, and he had said to Jesse, David's dad, hey, I've got great news. I'm here to anoint one of your boys to be king. And it ends up being David. And he receives this anointing, receives this promise from the prophet Samuel, from God saying, you will be king of Israel. Out of all of the people, I have chosen you to lead the people of God. And it's this huge moment. But since then, David has been going through the ringer. And he's been doing his absolute best to stay above board during this time, to live righteously, to live this holy life, to take the high road in all circumstances. But it hasn't been going well for him. Just the chapter before, and this is one of the really fun chapters I used to love to preach to grade school kids because it has a lot of bathroom humor in it. The king ends up in a compromised situation in a cave, and David has a chance to kill him. And all of his men are like, David, this is your moment. God has brought you the king, the man who's been hunting you and trying to kill you. And he is now at your mercy. God is handing him to you. Kill the guy. Be done with it. Take the throne. And instead of doing the easy thing, David says, no, I made a promise to honor the king. He is God's anointed one for now, and God will remove him from the throne when he's ready. But I'm not going to be the guy to do that. And so he takes the high road over and over and over again. But here he is. And it's been years. And nothing seems to be going right. He's camped out in the desert. He's hungry. He's filthy. He's homesick. He's terrified for his life. He's got 600 men looking to him. David, what's the next move? Where's the next meal coming from? What are we going to do? And so when he hears that Nabal is going to be shearing his sheep, this time of celebration, good spirits, he thinks to himself, okay, this is the moment. This might be the moment where things begin to turn around. And so he sends these 10 guys, and he says to them, tell Nabal this. And this is in chapter 25, verse 6. He sent 10 of his young men to Carmel with this message for Nabal. peace and prosperity to you, to your family, and everything that you own. I'm told that it's sheep shearing time. And while your shepherds stayed among us near Carmel, we never harmed them, and nothing was ever stolen from them. Ask your own men, and they'll tell you that this is true. So would you be kind to us? Since we've come at a time of celebration, please share any provisions you might have on hand with us and with your friend David. David's young men gave this message to Nabal in David's name, and they waited for a reply. Now, here's the thing that I know about living in the wilderness. Not much. But I do like to go camping, and I've gone hunting since I was a little kid. And the first thing that I know about living in the wilderness is that if I had to rely on my own hunting skills, I'd have died years ago. Just straight starvation. What I know about camping is that you pack a lot of stuff. When we go camping, there is a ton of stuff. I remember the first time we went camping with Wyatt on like a real camping trip. We went down to the Redwoods, and he was like a little over a year. He wasn't walking yet. We had to borrow my parents' Suburban and put one of those big Thules on top. And it was so packed, I wasn't sure the brakes were going to be able to stop us a couple of times. It was awful. And it was just 3 of us. It was so ridiculous. And we always pack so much food. Do you guys do this when you camp? We always come back. We always go with so much food. We were elk hunting this year, and we went with, 386 full Rubbermaid tubs of food. And every year we're like, man, we bring way too much food. But yeah, we had 6 men and 1 10-year-old, and we took a ton of food. David has 600 men that he has to feed and clothe and take care of and find water for. That's a lot of stress. That is a lot of stress. And I don't know about you, but when I get hungry, I get cranky. And when I get cranky, I don't make the best decisions in the world, which is why I don't ever do any of the grocery shopping. And so when these 600 men who are way out in the wilderness find that they're sharing this area with 3,000 goats and 1,000 sheep, it'd be really easy to rationalize just taking a couple of those for yourself. Nobody's going to know. And if they do know, nobody's going to do anything. What can they do? Who would be able to stop these guys? But instead of taking what they needed, instead of taking what they wanted, David has them protect the flocks and the shepherds. No, guys, we're not going to take what we need. We're going to protect somebody else's food at our expense. They didn't use their power to take. They used their power to protect. And David, once again, takes the high road in this situation. And so the response that Nabal sends back to David doesn't go over very well. Here's what it says. This is verse 10. This is Nabal's response to the kind, polite ask of David. Who is this fellow, David? Nabal sneered at the young men. Who does this son of Jesse think that he is? There are lots of servants these days who run away from their masters. Should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to a band of outlaws who come from who knows where? So David's young men returned and told him what Nabal had said. Have you ever been in a situation where you were stressed out? You ever get stressed? Have you ever been in a situation where you didn't know how you were going to move forward? You thought that you knew the future. You thought that there was a door that was opened up, and so you were walking through it, and that door gets slammed in your face. Have you ever been in a situation where you were stressed? Where you needed to make a decision, and you couldn't figure out what to do? And have you been in a situation where you've been stressed and you've been walking through a door that you're pretty sure God opened for you, but it gets slammed in your face, and you've been doing everything right? You've been making the right choices. You've been taking the high road. You've been sacrificing for this. And it gets worse and worse as it goes along. And even though you try to be righteous, even though you try to be holy, even though you try to be nice, it just gets worse every time. Have you ever been desperate? You ever started to lose hope? I've heard that when people begin to lose hope, they have one of two primary reactions. The first reaction, the first option that people take is to just give up, just freeze. I'm done. Lay down and die. I'm out. And the second primary reaction that people have when they begin to lose hope is that they make terrible, drastic decisions. Decisions they would not make in any other circumstances, but because of where they're at, because they're stressed, because there's no hope, they don't know what to do. They allow their lesser angels to take over. And all of those character flaws that they've been doing really good job of stamping down seem to come right to the surface and take over and shout down their better angels. I think this is where David's at this moment. I think that David, in his response to Nabal, is hoping. I think that he's hoping beyond hope that this is a moment that God's going to start to change things. That God, I've been doing all of this stuff. I've been taking the high road. I've been really nice. I've been sacrificing my comfort, my future, my wants and dreams for you. Please, let this turn around. This guy, I mean, he's wealthy. He's got tons of stuff. Maybe he could be my first real big ally in this. I mean, what if this is that God drove me here to meet this guy and this is where everything starts to turn around? That promise that you made years ago, God, is this the moment that it starts to come to fruition? And I think that David, sitting there in the middle of the desert, hoping beyond hope that these guys come back and say, hey, guess what? He's in. We're good. We're going to join him at his place, and we're going to have this celebration, and he wants to ally himself with you. Word of you has gotten around, and the people are excited and ready for a change. They want you for king. I think that's what David's hoping in this moment. And as he's sitting in the desert, waiting for these 10 young guys to come back, they bring bad news. Not only did they bring bad news, hey, it's a no-go, man, sorry, but it's also offensive. It's insulting. And David snaps. You ever snapped before? He's had it. He's done. This is what all of the hard work, this is what all the sacrifice has gotten me. I'm a beggar and a joke. Screw this guy. I'm done. I am absolutely done. We helped this guy out. We protected his sheep and his men, and this is how he repays me. I asked really nicely, and I'm done being nice. I'm done with the high road, and I'm done living like this. We're taking what we want. And so here's David's response. This is verse 13. Get your swords, was David's response, as he strapped on his own. Then 400 men started off with David, and 200 remained behind to guard their equipment. You ever been in a situation where you snap? David's lesser angels got the better of him in that moment. His frustration, his fear, his anxiety, his hopelessness, his rage takes over. And he makes a terrible decision. And while David is strapping on his sword and riling his guys up for murder, back at Nabal's house, his wife Abigail is just receiving word of what's taken place. She has this servant run into her, into her room, I'm assuming, or bump in the hallway or something, but this guy seems panicked. Here's what he says. This is verse 14. Meanwhile, one of Nabal's servants went to Abigail and told her, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he screamed insults at them. These men have been very good to us. We never suffered any harm from them. Nothing was stolen from us the whole time they were with us. In fact, day and night, they were like a wall of protection to us and the sheep. Abigail, you need to know this and figure out what to do. For there's going to be trouble for our master and his whole family. That's us, Abigail. He, their master, Nabal, is so ill-tempered that no one can even talk to him. So Abigail, intelligent, resourceful Abigail, jumps into action. Verse 18, this is how this woman reacts to hearing that a band of outlaw men, hundreds strong, are most likely on their way. Verse 18, Abigail wasted no time. She quickly gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 wineskins full of wine, 5 sheep that had been slaughtered, nearly a bushel, or about 10 gallons, worth of roasted corn, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 fig cakes. She packed them on donkeys and said to her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you shortly." She didn't tell her husband Nabal where she was going. So as she was riding her donkey, So she was riding her donkey into a mountain ravine. She saw David and his men coming toward her. David had just been saying to them, a lot of good it did to help this fellow. We protected his flocks in the wilderness, and nothing he owned was lost or stolen. But he repaid me evil for good. May God strike me and kill me if even one man from his household is still alive tomorrow morning. Can you even imagine being a young woman in this situation? Riding out into the desert to meet the men that your husband had just personally insulted, knowing who these guys are. Combat veterans that are absolutely torqued and are marching to kill you and your family. And as you ride your donkey, which is not the fastest or most graceful of all animals in the world, into this mountain ravine, you see, armed and armored, 400 men marching towards you, preparing themselves physically and mentally to murder your entire family. I think that'd be a little stressful. Abigail is a pretty impressive lady because she finds herself in a very similar situation to David. She has been put in this circumstance not of her own making. Somebody else did something really stupid that screwed up her life. It wasn't her fault. She didn't have anything to do with this. She has to be stressed out beyond belief. I can only imagine. She could be killed by these men in an instant. She could be taken hostage and used as a negotiation pawn. She has no idea. But instead of running away, instead of selling her husband out, instead of trying to defend the indefensible, listen to what Abigail does. This is verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed low before him. She fell at his feet and said, "I accept all blame in this matter, my lord. Please listen to what I have to say. I know Nabal is a wicked and ill-tempered man. Please don't pay any attention to him. He is a fool, just as his name suggests. But I never even saw the young men that you sent. Now, my lord, as surely as the Lord lives and you yourself live, Since the Lord has kept you from murdering and taking vengeance into your own hands, let all your enemies and those who try to harm you be as cursed as Nabal is. And here's a present that I, your servant, have brought to you and your young men. Please forgive me if I have offended you in any way. The Lord will surely reward you with a lasting dynasty, for you're fighting the Lord's battles, and you have done nothing wrong throughout your entire life. Even when you're chased by those who seek to kill you, your life is safe in the care of the Lord your God, secure in his treasure pouch. But the lives of your enemies will disappear like stones shot from a sling. See how she's hearkening back to this young boy, this young David who didn't fight because he was offended to defend his own honor against Goliath. He fought to defend God's honor. Very different circumstance here. When the Lord has done all that he has promised and has made you the leader of Israel, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. And when the Lord has done these great things for you, please remember me, your servant. It's quite the speech, huh? Intelligent indeed. See, what I see Abigail doing here is she's speaking not to the David who stands before her, but to the David that she needs him to be. The David that all of Israel needs him to be. She speaks to the very best of his character, to the very highest of the principles that he knows he should be living by. He knows that God has called him to be better. And she's speaking to that David, not the murderous, angry rage. She's speaking to his best self. She doesn't try to defend her husband. She doesn't try and tell David, hey, don't get your boxes in a wall. That's just Nabal being Nabal. Just don't pay any attention to it. It's no big deal. She owns it. She didn't have anything to do with this, and she owns it, and she apologizes for it, and she makes it better. She humbles herself, takes full responsibility of something she had nothing to do with, and makes it right. And in doing so, the entire situation is diffused. This is verse 32. This is David's response to Abigail's speech. David replied to Abigail, "Praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me today. Thank God for your good sense. Bless you for keeping me from murder and carrying out vengeance with my own hands. For I swear to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has kept me from hurting you, that if you had not hurried out to meet me, not one of Nabal's men would still be alive tomorrow morning." And then David accepted her present and told her, "Return home in peace. I've heard what you said. We're not going to kill your husband." The entire situation changed. Because Abigail spoke to David as if he was the man that God had created him to be. She didn't talk down to him. She didn't try to negotiate with him. She didn't try to do any of the fancy stuff that we see so often in our culture. She spoke to his best self. She reminded him that God has not left you. God wasn't aloof. God isn't out there somewhere doing something else and could care less about you. That is not the case. She reminds him of the promises that God had made. God has not forgotten those, David. He is at work right now. Taking the high road was not a mistake. God is still working on your behalf. Because Abigail spoke truth and life, everything changed. A single conversation kept him from doing something that would have been a stain on his entire life. He literally stopped in his tracks and changed direction because of a single conversation. A single conversation from somebody he'd never met before. Somebody who speaks truth, who speaks life, who speaks hope back into a situation where there seems to be none. It's a beautiful thing. She does end up becoming his wife. She goes home to tell her husband everything that happened. He had no idea all these things were going on behind the scenes. He had no idea there were 400 men coming to march and slaughter him and his family. She tells him this, and he falls completely paralyzed. It shocks him. He dies 10 days later. And David, being a man of good taste, takes her as his wife. The band's going to come up, and we're going to close tonight out. Here's what I want you to get from this story. I have no idea what's going on in your life. I've got no idea how this season's treating you. I've got no idea what's happening at work or home or with family stuff or just life in general. I don't know. But here's what I do know. I know that this little shepherd boy who ends up growing up into this incredible hero of the Hebrew people did not have a life of wine and roses. It was hard. He found him in situations where he had no idea what he was going to do. There was no way to get out of this stuff. And if you've ever read the Psalms, you know David is a man of deep, deep emotion. There is rage and anger and love and passion and despair like I've never experienced in my life in the Psalms. And there are moments when this shepherd boy who ends up being king is pouring his heart out to God and crying out, God, why have you left me? Why are all of these people trying to kill me? What have I ever done? And then moments when he turns back and he says, but you are my shepherd. I shall not want. I know that in the deepest moments where hope seems to be as far away as humanly possible, God is still at work. He was at work in David's life. He's been at work in my life. He is at work in your life. Working behind the scenes, doing stuff that we have no idea about. Until one day, something clicks and all is revealed. And if Christmas means anything, if Christmas is an analogy for anything at all, it is a reminder that God is always at work, that the love of God never stops, even when things are going on behind the scenes and we don't hear from God for 400 years. There is a God at work who desperately, passionately loves you. And that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Heavenly Father, thank you for David. Thank you for the man that he was, all of the quirks and strengths and failures. Thank you for the way that he sought you, who was a man after your own heart. Lord, I ask that as we jump back into work and life this week, that you would remind us that we are not alone. We don't walk out these doors by ourselves, that you go with us, that you go before us, and that you have our back. Thank you for the hope that you bring to our lives. Amen. Have a great week, Oasis. See you next week for Jingle Jam.